Hello everyone, I'm Tazeen Ahmed and welcome to this Vice News produced discussion about the digital and media rise of ISIS. We've called it the Islamic State Media Channel of the Year, and that's obviously a facetious title, and we're obviously not trying to acknowledge their brilliance or creativity, but more that they've become a real brand, a real force to be reckoned with. We're going to look at how the Islamic State has come to dominate the media landscape using their high production value, chilling and gruesome multimedia content. They are one of the first and most successful terrorist groups to take their ideology into the digital age in order to spread their message and recruit new followers. I have a panel who will help us understand how the Islamic State, despite being the most vile ideology of our time, has managed to brand itself so successfully and become a leading global media presence. How do they reach their audiences so effectively? How does the media cover their output? And what is our role as broadcasters in their rise? And what lessons can be learned from their warped but ultimately extremely successful international profile? Let me introduce to you my panelists. After the sort of first 45 minutes, we'll have 15 minutes where it'd be great to get some of your questions, so do start thinking about those. So my panelists are Mina Al-Lami, a jihadist media expert at BBC Monitoring, which watches thousands of traditional and social media sources across the world. She has 9 years of experience in researching, analysing and writing on the media operations and online platforms of jihadist groups. Arif Haq is a senior strategist and creative capabilities lead at Contagious, whose mission is to help companies achieve the top 1% of creative marketing ideas. Arif has worked in brands and marketing for the past 16 years and has studied the ISIS brand very closely. Before joining Contagious 3 years ago, he spent a decade working in branding at PepsiCo. Aris Rasonis is an award-winning journalist and filmmaker for Vice News. He's produced a breadth of in-depth and exclusive work from around the world, documenting the terror-led conflicts in the Middle East. Last year, he was embedded with Peshmerga forces and also has been documenting their day-to-day battle against the Islamic State. Alex Krasadomski-Jones is a researcher at the Center for the Analysis of Social Media, focusing on political extremism online. Alex is a frequent media commentator for Sky and the BBC. He was the lead of the Demos project, which matched the political tritosphere ahead of the 2015 general election and was launched on BBC Newsnight. Please do welcome them. Mina, can we start with you? Could you just start by telling us how rapid was ISIS's digital and media rise?
Yes, so IS burst into world stage in June 2014 with its lightning land grabs across Iraq and Syria, its brutal mass killings, and its declaration of its so-called caliphate. However, the foundations of its media operation, of its structure, were laid far before that during its various incarnations in Iraq as al-Qaeda in Iraq, Islamic State of Iraq. And so it was around, its predecessors were around since 2004 in Iraq. However, with the declaration of the caliphate, the so-called caliphate, IS has had to tailor its media operation to exploit the intense public and media interest in its actions. And so it started targeting an international global audience with a constant flow of high-quality visual propaganda, multilingual, often employing innovative and shocking methods to grab headlines.
How have you decided who the online caliphate is? A foot soldier, somebody who's sympathizing, ISIS HQ? What's the difference, and how do you know they all belong to the same thing?
It's really difficult to identify it, and I think it's a good question because a lot of the time media would flag up a threat by IS when it's actually one of their supporters or a pro-IS media group. IS has a very centralized media operation, although it delegates productions to various geographic offices. On the other hand, it has a vast network of dispersed supporters and semi-official media groups who help it promote and widely disseminate its message. And I think the group doesn't discourage a lot of its supporters from doing that because that only gives it the impression that it's wider and that its tentacles are spread everywhere. And the same goes with lone wolf attacks.
Aris, what did this look like on social media? You were one of the first reporters to look at this.
Yeah, in terms of their targeting an international as opposed to an Arab audience, quite a slowly evolving thing, actually. Like, the first thing I really noticed was before ISIS per se was actually formed, there was a small number of different jihadist katibas featuring units and personnel that later joined ISIS, releasing videos in English. Pretty low quality, actually. Like, you know, I think it's important to remember that when we talk about ISIS, the sophistication of ISIS's media strategy and its media production, it's starting from a very low base, and it's only very sophisticated compared to other jihadist groups. And their initial work was equally shoddy, like poorly shot, poorly framed, poorly edited. Then the English language stuff kind of happened unofficially, I'd say, at first. So if you look at British jihadists or content targeting them, it seemed to be individual fighters going off and targeting their own friendship networks at home through Facebook originally. Facebook was originally quite lax about kind of monitoring this kind of content. Then Twitter came later. Instagram actually became before Twitter. The first real kind of sophisticated ISIS content that came out was the Windows into the Land of Epic Battle series. The first kind of HD shot video that was coming out, the constant stream of videos. It was, again, compared to like their kind of 2014 content, still quite unsophisticated, long takes, fairly poorly edited, but quite arresting combat footage. It's important to remember that when ISIS was building its strength and its power on the ground in Syria particularly, like 2012, 2013, it suited them to kind of stay in the shadows. They rarely fought the regime. They generally fought other rebel groups for control of vital trade and access routes, and it basically suited them to be quite quiet. It wasn't until 2014 that they really, I'd say, made a concerted effort to attract an international audience.
And Alex, in those three or 4 years, or 2 or 3 years, how has their approach changed much?
I think it's changed as technology has changed, and I mean, I think we ought to think of these more as opportunistic moves than necessarily strategic ones. It shouldn't come to us as a massive surprise that these guys know how to use Twitter or know how to use Facebook. I mean, it did come as a surprise, but if you think about the origins of where these people have come from, many of them Western fighters, they've grown up not just with the digital skills, but also a culture of being on Facebook, being on Twitter. So it's no great leap to imagine you then do the same from Iraq or Syria. I think the other evolutions that we see, they move from Facebook then to Twitter, then to Instagram, now more recently to a platform called Telegram and various other places on the internet, is less a sort of strategic shift, but more just a kind of an opportunistic agnosticism. That's an awful set of two words, isn't it? Opportunistic agnosticism. Anyway, you get the idea. The idea that if they're under pressure on Twitter, they don't particularly care if they're shunted off Twitter. They'll move to somewhere else, move to Telegram and so on. So long as their message is being put out there, so long as they still have contact with people around the world who support them and may potentially think about venturing to Syria and Iraq, then that suits them, and it also suits Twitter and Facebook, because once they've got them, they're gone.
Arif, has that message been consistent in the last several years?
Interestingly enough, picking up on that point, the consistency piece doesn't seem to be particularly important to IS, certainly as much as someone like al-Qaeda, who are actually more of an exclusive club. IS's primary advantage, I think, in terms of strategy, in terms of media, is to pour as much reach as they can at the top of the funnel. So in advertising, we talk about the top of the funnel and getting people aware, and then they go through trial and consideration. And IS's strategy seems to be, if you don't like this tweet, there'll be another one along in a minute that you will like. It's just get out there, pack in the reach, local languages, offshoots, people who might be officially linked to IS, people who might not be. But their main thing is to decentralise their communications, it does seem. Some brands in the world are very centralised, and some brands in the world give their local markets much more freedom. IS are a brand that give their local markets the freedom to talk to their audiences in culturally specific ways. They're not too concerned about the consistency of the message overall, in favour of actually just get as many people interested in your notional ideology as possible.
And Mina, do they have a market, or is it just anyone and everyone?
In terms of IS invests heavily in, for example, you said that, but in branding, it has very eye-catching logos, very distinct statements, formats for its statements, and it is within jihadist groups. It is a trendsetter in terms of jihadist groups trying to emulate IS's online strategy. And in terms of market, you just look at recruitment. Now it is less than it was before, but surely there is a market, whether it's in the media or in the public, for IS's, the material and what it puts out, and it does exploit that, and it does know that it could tick certain boxes, that it know the West or the publics will pick on that to provoke a response and to get, to grab headlines. The group does kind of, it craves media attention. And I think one of the biggest challenge for it is innovation, is to keep public interest in its output, in its propaganda, its material.
Who are they appealing to?
Primarily young men as a target audience. So, like, if you look at their kind of blockbuster videos, has a very visual style derived from video games, like first-person shooters. Also from, I don't know if you've seen the film 300: Rise of an Empire, which is a terrible film, but the first time I watched it, I just thought that's an ISIS video, because they use exactly the same tricks. It's like desaturation, a kind of hyper-real, it's kind of shifts of focus and then of tempo, like speeding up, speeding down, like a kind of hyper-real colouring of blood. Like it's created kind of comic book ultra-violence aesthetic that does appeal to a certain subset of young men.
Okay, Alex, can you tell us a little bit about who those people are and what the attraction is for them?
It really varies. I mean, we've heard all kinds of stories about people who've gone to Syria and Iraq carrying, evidence that they perhaps aren't fanatical followers of Islam, and that's not their main reason for going. Others have, there's evidence on Facebook and Instagram that these people are sort of showing off their brand new ride with its chrome wheels, or their brand new gun, or the kebab that they're having for dinner. That somehow this is a kind of exciting adventure for them.
Like a holiday snack?
Yeah, like a holiday, like a gap year, and it's exciting, and there's all this free stuff. They've got swimming pools, and it's a level that's completely separate to that which is captured through the sort of more centrally controlled media arms.
Sorry, can
I
add to that? So if you look at that, like that kind of focus on like living in lovely villas in northwest Syria and like messing about in swimming pools and eating pizza and kebabs and stuff, that really came in about 2013 when ISIS basically weren't fighting anyone really, and life was quite easy. They had absolutely no fear, seemingly, of Western or even Syrian regime attacks. They did openly post pictures of all the government buildings they'd taken over, of the villas they're living in, with no fear of airstrikes. As Western intervention began to take place, and as the Syrian regime began to focus on ISIS as a threat, that shifted, and that kind of, lad's holiday in the sun aesthetic suddenly moved into a completely different gear. Like it all became more serious suddenly in about 2014.
But still attractive to young people.
Absolutely. I mean, it's telling to see also, the armed forces of the West. If you look at an ad for the RAF or the Navy or the US Army, they look like video games too. They look like Call of Duty, and there's a reason, because the idea of, in an age where younger people especially don't have a job for life, don't have an easier career path, they're suffering through various economic strains that we know about, in a life where with the analysis paralysis that comes with so much choice, actually absolutism offers some kind of solace, a way, an adventure, as we talked about, a way out of the ambiguities that lots of young people have to grapple with at the moment.
Okay, well, let's just think more now about their strategy. We'd like to show you a clip of how they present themselves to potential recruits. Arif, as branding goes, do you think that's impressive?
What's very interesting about it is that Islamic State have really established one thing in the minds of the audience, and including us as the audience, in terms of strength. Strength is what they projected. Now, this is moving into something not directly appraised, but something slightly different, which is social warrior. And strength plus social warrior is a pretty compelling argument. that particular piece of work, it's professionally done. We all saw that, and you can have your questions about how many of those things were staged or not. But yeah, it's a smart move to actually add social warrior to strength. It makes complete sense about why they might want to do that at this time when maybe their strength and their brutality is becoming kind of conflated. So actually, there's another side to Islamic State. They're saying, we do good. We provide food and healthcare for the people that we not conquer, but make free.
But this idealistic, nonsensical narrative, why is it working with young people?
Oh, it's vital to the whole operation. I think, particularly, I think we'll talk more about this in regards to women, is that, they're saying that, as opposed to the videos you used to see in the past where, Islamists were hiding in caves or whatever, we have a town, we have a city, we have a civilization, we have a health service, we have fun fairs. Now that's important, important for everyone, important for men who would want to bring their children over, but particularly for women for whom this is going to be a vital part of any decision made to move to Syria or move to Iraq and be part of this movement.
Amina, you've been monitoring how they attract women. What are they doing?
Well, I mean, this whole theme of utopia, of the governance that IS provides, is one of the key genres in its media production, and as with many other ultra extremist jihadist groups, women don't feature in their propaganda, their visual propaganda. However, through these videos, for example, these ones where they're showing that they provide healthcare, education, that IS is a good place for people to come and live and bring their families, that is indirectly targeting, well, it's not only targeting fighters, because the call before for al-Qaeda and other groups was a call for jihad. Even IS before it became the Islamic State, it was a call for jihad because this was a war, this was a battle. But now it's calling for migration, which means families moving and settling in the state to be part of this effort to build a state. And with that, although they don't provide any kind of specific message to women, because actually they don't want to show them probably how boring it will be for women to come and actually just raise, have kids and raise them as the cubs of the next generation.
At best.
At best. But they give the indication that you will be part of something big, building this caliphate. You will be part of this. And for young people, that's appealing, being part of this historical moment in time of, the establishing the caliphate. But also we can't dismiss maybe the allure of romanticism, romanticizing the caliphate, and also the jihadist warrior, being a wife of a mujahid warrior. That is also one of the pull factors. The other thing with the women, one of the messages it directly targeted women was in its magazine Dabiq, when it addressed not only single women but also married women, and it told them that if you're married to a Muslim who's basically not part of IS, then your marriage is void and you should migrate to the land of the caliphate, whether you're in the West or in other states, because it simply wants to populate and strengthen its states.
Aris, did you get any kind of impression that there is some sort of digital strategy in place, that they're not just opportunistic, as Alex was just describing a little while ago?
Yeah, I mean, obviously everything is actually, it's hard to know for sure, like how devolved their media strategy is in terms of, say, if you look at like their regional sub offices, so each wilayat, pumps out videos and photos. We just don't know, like, whether that's all signed off by like some guy sitting in Raqqa, or do they have like complete autonomy over what they put out. But yeah, there are certain specific themes that they put across. That utopianism is one of them. I'm a bit sceptical myself. I know a lot of analysts have argued very cogently that kind of utopian vision is like the central plank of ISIS's messaging. Certainly statistically, it is like the bulk of their output. But if you look at how it's received amongst its kind of core audience of fanboys, it doesn't get the same attention, doesn't get the same level of retweets or like resharing that the more kind of big ticket, spectacular, basically gore and explosions do. I think it is also simply a question of production. It's just easier if you're based in Raqqa, and most of the media production is based in Raqqa, to just go out and take lots of nice shots of the sunset, on the river, and then pump them out, as opposed to like going off to a front line where, who knows what will happen, and it's just simply logistically more difficult to send back good footage.
There is something else interesting about that point, which is that they're playing very two powerful archetypes in branding, which is in there they are saying we are the leadership of brand. We're here to stay. We're a state. The clue's in the title, and we have all these health services and arms of the state. But they're known as well for being the challenger brand. So they're being Coke and Pepsi at the same time. There's not many brands in the world that are able to do that. We obviously know the hugely seductive factor of a challenger brand with the trusted element of being a leadership brand, and that has a lot to do with the allure of the Islamic State.
And how would you say, Alex, that brand ISIS compares to brand al-Qaeda?
It's difficult to say. It's for me. It's a question of continuity. But what the rise of digital has created has been the ability for, whether it's centralized, whether it's not, the ability to decentralize, so the ability to almost franchise out the Islamic State and for somebody to be involved or to claim responsibility far outside any knowledge of any kind of central administration.
Yeah. And are you able to draw a comparison between the two?
There's I think that from my point of view, the centralised versus decentralised is probably the central factor that differentiates al-Qaeda and Islamic State. Certainly, if you look at the exclusiveness that al-Qaeda put in terms of who can join, what you need to know in terms of scripture, and what you need to know in terms of how they operated, their security cell structure in al-Qaeda was very tight. Was Islamic State fairly easy to infiltrate Islamic State, as we've seen, and security services are doing that. So this franchise is a good term for it. Let Islamic State be interpreted in its various local culture through its provincial information offices, through things like Dabiq and so on. But the localization of the Islamic State brand is particularly interesting, and I think part of the reason it's so powerful at the moment. Big brands go through this global, local cycle every about 4 or 5 years where they centralise and decentralise, and I think Islamic State have chosen to say, go out there and centralise, and when you get things a bit wrong, then they'll sort of be reminded, no, come back to the centralised messages, the iconic brand assets of the flag and so on, and all those kind of elements.
And in terms of, I'll come back to you in a moment, Aras, in terms of that decentralisation, there's no better example than lone wolves and what they do. And in many ways, lone wolves are very handy for them because they don't have to structure that at all. It just happens. And Omar Mateen with the Orlando shooting is a very good example because they were very quick to say that he was one of theirs before we even knew anything. It's still not clear what was behind, what the motives were behind that attack.
Yeah. IS had a shift in its strategy in September 2014, whereby it started calling for attacks in the West, and that was previously the al-Qaeda foreign enemy versus IS, with focusing on the local enemy. And since then, it has made several calls. The leadership has made several calls for attacks in the West, and compared to al-Qaeda, IS has managed to inspire far more people to carry out attacks. Now, what it has said to these, to sympathizers is that you do not have to consult the group, you don't have to consult anyone. The only thing it did ask them, interestingly, was that they needed to register their pledge of allegiance to IS through any means, and that was in Dabiq. So they said, record it, or maybe tweet. So a tweet is enough for someone to allow IS then to take credit for these attacks. And it has these attacks have worked in the sense of showing IS to be kind of ubiquitous, that it has its tentacles all over the world when it's not really accurate. These are people who are inspired by its cause, which is also worrying, of course.
Sorry, I was going to add that in terms of similarity or dissimilarity with al-Qaeda, al-Qaeda has within itself a number of different brands. So if you compare ISIS to core al-Qaeda, then obviously ISIS is more interesting. Core al-Qaeda is essentially Zawahiri, an old man basically lecturing a camera for an hour and a half, which is profoundly boring. If you look at al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, they pioneered the kind of use of GoPro combat footage. They produced very ISIS-like content. Al-Shabaab were edging towards that. Jabhat al-Nusra, or now Jabhat al-Fatah al-Sham, who are the official al-Qaeda group in Syria, in some ways they produced very similar content to ISIS in terms of they were later adopters of the use of more sophisticated camera technology and the editing ability, but they have similar use of drone footage, similar use of GoPro footage. And if you look at the kind of banter essentially on social media between Jabhat al-Nusra fighters and ISIS fighters in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra members almost see themselves as like the kind of more discerning choice as opposed to like the mass market ISIS that everyone goes on.
And I guess another key difference is the fact that al-Qaeda had figureheads, you had faces. There was, bin Laden, Zawahiri, Zarqawi, so all these faces. Well, ISIS actually doesn't have. I mean, temporarily it does when someone carries out an attack, but they're then forgotten, which is probably a very important part of their branding.
You've got that's the luxury versus the mainstream positioning. It's like ISIS are out there, and al-Qaeda very much have their icons, and you sort of aspire to them, and they're up there, and maybe in a cave, but you're still there. And ISIS are everywhere, and they're big retailers, if you like.
Alex, is their digital strategy, their digital and media strategy working? Is it successful?
I think it has been successful. I think it's been helped particularly by their ability to sort of package and spoon feed content to mainstream media organisations, entirely deliberately. It's English language, it's staged, it's perfectly set up to just be pulled straight off the internet and chucked out onto mainstream television. So as far as that goes, I would say, yeah, I think it has been successful.
Okay, let's take a look now at what the counter response to ISIS can be. Let's have a look at what the US State Department's response has been. Samina, is that any good?
The thing is, just as IS always highlights, victims of purportedly of coalition airstrikes, which putting out very graphic images of how Muslims are being killed by by Western powers. I think it is important to show how the majority of victims of IS victims are Muslims in these countries. Now, the problem is sometimes is that it's kind of you have the message and you have the messenger. So the source sometimes kind of could undermine how people receive that message because of existing suspicions in Muslim countries and others about Western countries and what they're trying to do.
Well, the US State Department have no credibility with young Muslim kids.
Exactly. So it's really difficult. And these we're still, I think, in experimental stage when it comes to counter messaging, counter narratives. And they're very difficult to measure. How do you measure the success of this video or other documents or clerics, kind of moderate clerics, and their impact? Has there been sampling of people who have changed their mind as a result of, said, I changed after I watched this video or others, and it showed me what, the reality of IS. So it's really difficult to gauge.
Alex, the US State Department is rightfully perhaps scaling back or thinking about scaling back the way that they respond and leaving it to third parties. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, vitally. I think governments, when dealing with these kinds of organisations, are inevitably not credible voices. You can draw a lot of parallels between this kind of material and conspiracy theory, trying to debunk conspiracy theories, where no matter what the government says, because they are the government and they're obviously lying or something's not accurate. So yeah, you do have to turn to third parties. The only problem with that is that we're outnumbered and outgunned. Outnumbered because, if you're working for a third sector charity or even working in the civil service in the Foreign Office, you wake up in the morning, go in at 9 o'clock, clock off at 5, do what you can, while on the other hand, you're dealing with people who spend their entire days and often their nights churning this stuff out, backing up content, resharing content, creating new content. This is the thing that they're doing all the time. And the quality of the content is much better. I mean, we've seen the State Department there. Our Foreign Office did a video which is basically like a PowerPoint presentation, and you've got to think, is this really, not only are they producing more content, and they're also producing better content. So it's a problem.
So who are the credible counter voices in this?
I think one of the thoughts we need to take into the counter narrative discussion is, maybe not what our counter narrative, but what is our narrative. And the analogy in branding is that some brands get into this. It's a term for it called the Mephisto waltz, which you define your competition as so tight. The most famous being Coke and Pepsi. I don't mean to talk about them all the time, but they happen to be the most famous examples, where all you can do is mirror. You end up mirroring the other competitors' actions and doing this this dance of death, where you spiral around, completely blind to actually what's going on in the rest of the world and who else your competitors might be. And so constantly thinking about the counter-narrative is sometimes a little bit blinkered, because you're just reflecting you're saying what the other person is not. We saw this in the Brexit debate, and there's lots of reasons why Remain didn't win, but one of them I would posit is the fact that the campaign was just being the opposite of the other side. And actually, what's the narrative of that? And I think we've not found it easy to find the narrative that doesn't just play back the opposite of what the other guys are saying.
Aris, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree, absolutely. I mean, to be honest, I think the whole idea of a US government or UK government-funded counter-narrative strategy is just completely pointless and will fail. If you look at the State Department's Think Again, Turn Away Twitter feed, that was just an embarrassment. The British government there's a video called Abdullah X, you can find it on YouTube, which is to convince young British Muslims not to go off and join ISIS and go to Syria. It's not fun. And it has all the urban credibility of like a Radio 4 afternoon drama. It's just terrible.
I like Radio 4 afternoon drama.
Any kind of counter-narrative strategy like that, I just don't think will work. Like ISIS, basically, they are, I hate to use these terms, but young millennial digital natives in a way that anything going through the government tending process, through civil servants and then to production companies and then down to the finished product, it's just not going to work. So the way to do it is, ISIS has two main weaknesses. One, they don't have their own kind of hosting platform for video, so they're reliant on basically American technology. Archive.org has now got better at removing ISIS content. YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, it gets taken down immediately now. So there's less means of disseminating it. So they can film as much as they want. If they can't actually share it, then it's pointless. The second angle is the ISIS message is basically that the Islamic State remains and is expanding. And the best way to counteract that is effectively just to defeat them on the ground. The more ISIS loses territory, the less able it is to promote its message that it will inevitably achieve victory, then the less of an audience it will find.
Do you agree with that?
I totally agree with that. And 2 points is that the first is the main challenge facing IS at the moment is the online clampdown on its accounts. And we can see that playing out very clearly on the internet. True, it's you won't eliminate the group or its supporters. You can't do that online. However, we have seen that it has disrupted their media operation. It has diverted their attention from launching these very effective hashtag campaigns on Twitter to promote IS, the IS brand, also defend the group, to simply struggling to stay online. Every day they have to create new accounts. So even if they launch a Twitter campaign, it's not like it was before where you have a very active hashtag. Actually now you go to that campaign and it's really a failure because all these accounts have been taken out. And initially it was only on Twitter and they moved to Telegram and they thought that for a while it was a stable platform. However, Telegram, in terms of suspensions, has mirrored Twitter. YouTube has always, for a long time now, has been very unfriendly, very hostile for IS propaganda, and they're very proactive in taking down IS material. The same with Facebook. It was really never a suitable platform for IS, simply, again, for all other jihadist groups, again, because it was very proactive. And the other thing is defeating them on the ground. We can see the IS message also slightly changing, the recruitment message changing. Recently, the group, in a May message, they kind of implicitly, they implied that they are aware that they may be losing more. They were preparing its supporters that they will be losing more territory. And they come up with this idea that it's not really about remaining and expanding. It's really about, you are not defeated as long as you have, the will to fight. And so its message changed. Instead of calling for people to migrate to its territory, it told people, don't bother to migrate to our territory. Just stay where you are in the West and carry out attacks. And the message has changed because of that. So I think it does defeat this whole slogan of remaining and expanding.
Do you think it's a winnable digital battle?
No, I don't. I think not in the terms that perhaps at the moment the select committee report that came out yesterday on extremism seemed to think this was some kind of winnable battle. You just have to take a parallel of any other kind of nasty content online. It's out there, and if you want to find it, you'll find it. And no matter the best attempts of Facebook and Twitter and so on, who, by the way, are much more interested in removing the content from their platform for their shareholders, not the internet more broadly. So I think there's two points there. One, I agree with what the panel said, is that a military defeat on the ground is fundamental. And two, I think it's a broader point where we need to teach people, particularly young people, to be a little bit more skeptical about what they see online, a little bit more cynical about what they see online, and the impact. This can touch on every issue. There's more and more of young people's lives are spent online, and they encounter whatever it might be, pornography, their friends' Facebook social media feeds, 9/11 truther videos which show you it wasn't actually a plane, it's something else, and indeed Islamic State propaganda. And they have the skills, the digital skills, and the digital cynicism, I suppose, to interact with those videos and treat them with the skepticism that they deserve.
Just before we go to questions, I just wanted to get some responses from you guys about how IS are using the mainstream media without even trying. So the Russell Square attack is a very good example where it had nothing to do with Islamic terrorism, yet that story became global, within minutes of it happening. How are they using it? They don't have to do very much, in fact, do they?
Well, the smart thing they've worked out is how to hack our, I call it the advertising industrial complex, right? Because everything that we do, that you guys are doing here, is basically funded by brands. Eyeballs, that's what advertising is. So they've figured out fairly early on, simplistically, if you put terrorist faces on newspapers, it sells newspapers. And from the or you run with a lead on the news, a terrorist face. And so I really applaud papers like Le Monde in France who've made a deliberate decision to say, you know what, we're not going to put their face, we're not going to iconize them, we're not going to make them martyrs. That's the first time where actually we've, I think, made a chink in their strategy, because up until then we've been entirely predictable about how we cover these and our response to them, and I think for the first time that was a deliberate pull-up. And I realise it compromises the principles of journalism to report things objectively, but it's an absolutely positive move, I think, in the battle to how we...
Well, actually, can I get... What do you think, Aris? Was
Yeah,
that the right move by the French media?
I don't know. I don't really see the point. I think that leads into... That will actually cause more political issues in France, because it's...
But as a broadcaster's, sort of...
I think it's
code
important.
of
Obviously,
ethics.
it's important not to share ISIS media as is. I'd say the prime disseminator of ISIS content in the Western world is probably the Mail Online, which has a multitude of ISIS reporters basically putting out every video they do.
But this idea about not naming or showing terrorists, which we've been doing up until, and we continue to do, is that a good idea? Because, of course, if you don't name or show them, you're not playing a part in their glorification. Do you guys anyone else want to come in?
I think there must be a balance between the two, because on the one hand, the public does have the right to know about the level of threat that it faces, but we have to also report these events very responsibly. Also, maybe just something providing context about these attacks, maybe something to say that IS, these claims are opportunistic, that these individuals don't necessarily have to have links with IS, but it's just claiming credit for it based on a tweet or something, a Pledge of Allegiance. And the other thing is, avoiding any kind of sensationalist headlines or making it seem like IS is everywhere, because then IS uses that footage from mainstream media in its videos and its fixed sections in Dabak, in their own, at the enemy, in their own words. And they just take how the media not glorifies, but how it reports on IS and kind of the threat from IS, and it uses it to its own advantage.
Yeah,
so
like it did particularly with Jihadi John.
Exactly. So I think it's just having that balance and kind of responsible reporting.
Yeah. Sorry, what I was going to say was, if you look at the example of super injunctions against celebrities in the media, if people want to find out who did something or what happened, they will find out. The internet exists, they can do that. And by, I'd say, being overcautious in terms of sharing the facts of the case, as some in the French media are now doing, that then feeds into a narrative that the mainstream media don't dare tell us the truth about what's really happening, which then feeds wider social discohesion, which then further helps the ISIS narrative. So there is obviously a middle ground. So you see that in terms of when ISIS content is shared, people show a screen grab and then they report the content of the video without actually sharing the video. That is probably the best balance.
Okay, well actually I think it's quite a good time now to go to the audience, perhaps hear some of your thoughts about that. So if there are any questions, please do just raise your hand. A microphone's going around. Yes, there's one at the back there.
It was just sort of on that point. I think it needs to be incumbent on the Western media to report these things that when they're really it's criminal acts, or as opposed to trying to find a link to terrorism. It does feel very much like people try and find a link to terrorism as soon as possible. as opposed to saying, actually, it's a guy in Leytonstone with a knife in his hand, and all he has to say is Allah Akbar, and that's it. I mean, that's...
And in fact, that's
just
all everyone's listening out for. And that's happened a lot over the last couple of months.
The first time I hear anything in the news now, I go mentally, please don't let me be brown and don't let me be Muslim, right? And it's any crime, and it's the first news report that hits up on the radio, and that's what I think a lot of... you don't have to be brown and Muslim to think that, by the way, but there is this trying to build a bridge to a global movement, and that Allahu Akbar thing is a classic example. We saw that in the Australian backpacker murder only just in the last few days. That has nothing to do, from what we know, with IS. It seems to be a jilted lover or something like that, from my understanding.
But to be fair, sorry, that also seems to be what ISIS is doing, like in terms of, when a lone wolf attack happens, and then the day later there's a kind of Amak claim, a soldier of the caliphate. All they're waiting for is some proof in the Western media that it has some connection to, jihadism or like jihadist thought, for them to latch onto it. To a degree, Amak's just like a clickbait content farm somewhere in Raqqa where they latch onto random acts of violence in the West.
And I think it does differ from one country to another. And we saw, for example, the Russell Square attack. I followed the news, and most of kind of the reporting was, pointed to some kind of psychological problems. And it is different from other countries where you instantly get this link with terrorism or Islamic State.
But this is a real problem for mainstream media. Surveys are showing increasingly that trust in mainstream media is falling, and people are turning to alternative news sources, or they're consuming news through social media channels where everything's algorithmically determined to show you most popular content, which is inevitably more clickbaity. So you have a real problem here, right? How do you sustain the mainstream media business model while competing with falling trust and increasing moves towards increasing levels of trust, not just viewership, but trust in alternative media sources who are much, much less likely to use this levels of editorial control that we might expect?
Okay, thanks, Alex. Any other questions? There's one over here, and I'll come back over there.
Hi. I just want to say that this has been a really good panel, and thanks very much for taking your time. But does the panel think that actually journalism, and especially television journalism, is in a better place now to report on what's going on in Syria because of the media outlets of the Islamic State, and that journalists no longer have to rely on Ministry of Defence handouts of bombings and take State Department lines? Obviously, we have to take what's given from any outlet, be it the State Department or be it media or anything, with a pinch of salt, but it gives the public another insight into another viewpoint. And are we in a better place now?
Well, obviously, I'm going to say no, because you're just taking the ISIS handouts instead, which is obviously like a very highly mediated, centrally controlled propaganda, like very sophisticated propaganda output. So it's not like looking at ISIS videos gives you an unvarnished look at like the reality of what's going on in Syria. It's just presenting you with an alternative propaganda message. Obviously, the rise of ISIS has made it a lot harder for journalists to work in Syria because ISIS kidnaps and murders journalists, and also local Syrian activists or media activists. So no, I disagree.
Okay. Yes, some questions here. Lady in the pink.
You mentioned loss of trust in mainstream media. As it happens, I work for Channel 4, but I regularly see statistics for the levels of trust in television news. And there are really, really high levels of trust in television news in Britain. Not just Channel 4's, BBC's as well. And I think because we have that level of trust, I do think we have to, that's good in many ways, but I think we have to think very carefully about how we're covering things. And I'm very interested in lots of these new ideas about how we should limit how we cover things. I think language is really important. Why do we talk about lone wolves? That's very macho. Jihadi John, I can't stand these nicknames. But I am really disturbed that in my daughter's age group, she's age 19, living in London, and I've seen studies as well about this, the the very high percentage of young people who think that they're going to be victims of a terrorist attack. And I have to keep saying, we live near the Holloway Road. It's one of the most dangerous roads in Britain. You've got to be really careful how you cross the road. That's what you need to worry about. The statistical likelihood of you being in an attack is low, but somehow, and I think we have to say that we've contributed to this in some way, young people are really believe the idea that terrorist attack are much more likely to happen than they actually are.
Okay, thank you, Dorothy. I didn't recognise you at first. Anyone wanted to respond to that, or should we just take another question? Yeah?
Certainly, compared to the 70s or 80s, Western Europe is the safest ever been in terms of terrorism. You know, I mean, it is. Yeah, I totally agree.
Okay. Yes. Just at the front here.
So my question is in terms of, you talk about your counter-narrative strategies. Given different media outlets have essentially different objectives, so whether you're public trust, feel you have certain different objectives to your viewers, and like you touched on, there's alternative media platforms. How do you create a coherent counter-narrative if different media outlets follow different ones? So one is going to be slightly more sensationalist. Does it matter if the others decide to tone down because everyone will just go to that one? So would it only work if they all follow the same plan? And how would you even manage to achieve that?
Well, Arif, would you like to answer that?
I mean, from a brand point of view, you want a consistent, coherent counter-narrative, yeah, so you've spoken to exactly the right point. Every objective of the media outlets is slightly different. The biggest one being what gets commercial eyeballs to drive, you know, money for our advertisers, and each way that you get that will be very different for each news channel. I don't think it's impossible. I don't think you have to be, everyone has to say the same thing, but from a practical point of view, that is an absolute barrier, yeah.
Okay, another question? Yeah, at the back there.
Hi, I'm just thinking about how, while I missed most of it, in Northern Ireland was of course crippled by the Troubles, and we had like the famous one of Gerry Adams and everyone else being silhouetted in black while someone else spoke his lines. Do you think that by taking out any reference to, you know, like Jihadi John, and like taking away the names of these things, we just create a curiosity to actually go out and then forward it? And just as an aside, I remember Lord Hill saying, I don't know what Snapchat is, but the terrorists do. Do you think regulators just need to be able to be more educated about media and terrorism?
I mean, I think that's a very good point. And I mean, myself, sometimes if I do, if there is a certain event or an attack, and I don't find enough information, I do go to Twitter and other platforms to see if I can get more details, because I am interested, and a lot of people are interested. So I think you are right in that it might create more curiosity. And the problem is where people go looking for the information, it might not be, it might not provide the accurate context or facts about a certain person or attack. You might get IS or the jihadist version of it online, and it might seem a bigger threat than it is, or this person might be portrayed as someone who's, these people glorified him, he used to be this and that, whereas in the media you do read about, this person having, used to be a petty criminal. I think this information about the background of these people are really important, and you do get that from mainstream media, whereas you go to other platforms, they kind of lionize that person, they glorify him and his past.
It's difficult. Okay, there were some more questions over here. Yeah.
I still haven't completely understood how they got so good, because if you think about the geographies and the cultures that ISIS comes from, it's not exactly Shoreditch. Do you know, we're making analogies with smart digital media operations in the West. How did they get that? Is it simply a function of Western-based Muslims going there? Is that how they got it? And what are their archetypes that they follow from? Because often I think it looks like music videos. It looks like African-American music videos.
I'll answer this briefly, and then I'm sure you guys have a different point. From an advertising point of view, a marketing point of view, there is much more similarity than there ever was between a 22-year-old in London and a 22-year-old in Shanghai, or a 22-year-old in Melbourne, or a 22-year-old in Addis Ababa. And that's partly because of... Sorry? one of the highest YouTube penetration and consumption in the world is Saudi Arabia. There is a global internet culture that ignores geographical barriers, apart from the fact that some countries don't have YouTube or Facebook. But you're right, the music, film, and those types of cultures actually play a massive role in homogenising the view of what is cool, what's bad, what's good, what looks good, how you appeal to certain audiences. And that's what I'd explain it. Young people are much more similar today around the world than they've ever been.
Alex, did you want to respond?
Yeah, it kind of comes back to that surprise also links back to the question we had before about the question around regulation and governance of this. There's a skills crisis here. There's a skills crisis at a political level. There's a skills crisis at a policing level, where the speed at which new technology has emerged, the speed at which it's embraced by early adopters, usually the young, has meant that the laws that we have to govern it and the people who we expect to enforce those laws are playing catch-up. And they will continue to play catch-up. And one of the things that politics is particularly bad at is moving at pace, moving at speed. And you can guarantee that as soon as the extremism, or should any extremism bill be passed, it will suddenly become outmoded. And even now that the police are relying on laws like the Malicious Communications Act and others to punish these kinds of offences online, which are hopelessly out of date. So there is this old and young division when it comes to technology, particularly around the internet, is a really striking one when it comes to dealing with terrorist propaganda, among other things.
Okay, is there a final question? Yes. Would you mind just waiting for the microphone, just a moment?
I was wondering, what's your point of view on the responsibility of our own propaganda, like the Western propaganda? What struck me of the clips that you showed was that clip about the good side, so the health service and the education service. It looked like a corporate video from an insurance company, and I'm thinking it's almost like that this media war that they're doing is mirroring the same propaganda that leads maybe young people to disbelieve the word of mainstream media. So, although I agree that we've, especially in the UK, but also with Vice, other places, you have news that are definitely not propaganda and they're really showing the other side of the story. But I'm wondering, what's the responsibility of that type of propaganda that we have in the effects that we're seeing now with this?
I think one of the key distinctions we need to make is between counter narratives and alternative narratives, and that's vital in this. So I don't know, you saw the Islamic State Health Service, right? The counter narrative says actually it wasn't any good anyway, and we've blown it up. The alternative narrative says we have an extremely successful health service here in this country, and as a young Muslim, you can work in that industry, you can have a job for yourself, you can build a career, you can look after your family here. It has nothing to do with blowing up any hospitals in Syria or Iraq. So I think we have a role to play. All of the focus, particularly from government, has been on the counter-narrative. I don't even know where that word came from. We need to focus, as we've heard from other members on the panel, of a narrative of our own, an alternative narrative about what it means to be young and Muslim, but also recognise what it means to be socially isolated, to be poor in the UK, to not have friends, to not speak the language, and try to understand how we bring those people up to sort of share our common vision of what it means to live in the United Kingdom, rather than just sort of seeing what the last thing Islamic State throw over and slagging it off and saying, oh no, it's not real, or it's nothing like that, or we've already blown it up.
Okay. Just to wrap up, I'd like to add, as somebody who's covered extremism and terrorism stories several times over the last 20 years, that I think, and I know you guys talked about whether or not the battle is, as long as it's won on the ground, then we win this battle digitally and media-wise, but I do think that we've got to find a way to engage those young people who are being attracted to this ideology because of some kind of personal, political, or existential crisis. And if we resolve that, then there will be no appetite for the likes of ISIS. Thanks so much for coming and for your questions, and also thank you very much to my wonderful panelists.